Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Giri-Murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. And this is the home edition. As you can see, I'm in my study, so if you can hear the builders banging next door or children screaming around the house, I apologise. It's just the way things are. My guest this week is a former political party leader, a member of the Scottish Parliament. She was once regarded as the great hope of the Conservative Party, and in some quarters she still is. Ruth Davidson, welcome.
Hello.
We don't normally talk about the immediate news on this podcast, but I think there are two sort of overwhelming issues at the moment that we kind of have to start with. So first of all, let me ask you about your lockdown. You know, I see you're in your office now, but how has your lockdown been?
Yeah, well, you can also see I've got my lockdown haircut, courtesy of my partner, Jen, who gave me it 2 nights ago because I was beginning to look like I had an otter's pelt. So I think she's done an all right job. So I was a bit nervous. And then when she finished doing mine, I offered to turn around and say, you know, Pet, do you want me to have a go at yours? And she told me I was getting nowhere near her. But then she'd probably seen the way in which I'd clipped the dog and how badly that had gone. So she was probably right. But yeah, I mean, we've had up days, we've had down days. We're both working from home as much as we can. The Parliament is sitting a couple of days a week, but it's doing a lot of things online as well. And we've got an 18-month-old and a hyperactive 4-year-old spaniel who was in the vets yesterday because he damaged his paw again. So, it's juggling. And I have been trying to help. My parents are quite vulnerable. We also set up a kind of local community group as well to help out some of the vulnerable elderly neighbours that we have. So it's been really, really busy. That seems to be the overwhelming feeling of lockdown, is it's been really busy.
Has that made it less stressful because you've just had to sort of get on?
I think what's been good about it, because I've talked before about having suffered periods of mental ill health in my past and depression, and the things that trigger me tend to be areas of high stress, of not feeling that I'm in control of things, of not being able to have a bedtime that I can stick to, and all this sort of thing. And this sort of thing, this lockdown, is something that would immediately red flag to me that I need to take care of myself. And actually, having the sort of purposeful activity that I've had, focusing on my son, focusing on the huge amount of constituency work that I think every elected representative has had, whether it's council, Commons, Holyrood, Northern Ireland Assembly, wherever, trying to help people, direct them to where the help is, has been really beneficial. And it's meant that it's had a focus, so it hasn't been aimless. And while I do feel that I've been detached from some of the kind of people in my life that I want to give a hug to, it hasn't felt as lonely or as isolated as some people, I think, who perhaps live on their own, who don't have a young child sort of jumping on their head 24/7, they'll have had different stresses during this time.
How has having a young child changed, what sort of sets off your mental health, if you like? I mean, a lot of people find, I think, I certainly do, that, you kind of, the things that you used to find impossible, you don't anymore because you're thinking about somebody else. And the things you used to find scary, you're now worrying about what's scary for them rather than for you. I don't know whether you found that.
I mean, I think when people say it'll change everything, you're kind of like, yeah. Look, I'm 40, I think, when and I pretty much know myself. And actually, they're right. It changes absolutely everything. And it can make you feel under pressure sometimes, and you can feel guilty that, I went back to work after sort of 6 months and put him into childcare. So, I felt like I was being a bad mother for doing that. But then when I came back to my work, I still wasn't able to operate at the level I'd operated at before, because I wasn't able to do all the evening work, the weekend work, the receptions, all of the stuff that politicians do, that takes up so much time that's outside of parliamentary hours. So I felt like I wasn't doing my job well enough. So you get the guilt, and I think everybody gets the guilt that they're not operating to the optimum that they want to be at both sides of their life. But also, like, it's a joy as well. I mean, he's hilarious. He's 19 months old and he is absolutely hilarious. And
It's
there's
a
not a
great
day
age.
goes by that, yeah, he is. Like, I don't laugh at him. And I'm terrified for him. He has a propensity to throw himself off of things, to climb on things when you're not watching and then jump off them. But yeah, and you look around the world, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. There's all of these external factors that you want to keep your child safe from. But that doesn't trigger me in the way that I worry about. Because at the moment I'm enjoying having our little family unit in the house with the dog and the wife and everything.
We'll come back to some of those thoughts, I'm sure, but we're recording on Tuesday the 9th of June. Britain is gripped right now by the fallout of the George Floyd killing and the protests. And in the last couple of days in particular, the whole UK really has been staring at itself in the mirror and thinking about its own history as a result of this. We've seen the tearing down of that statue in Bristol. There are similar campaigns in Scotland as well. I know in Glasgow there have been sort of attempts to rename street names and to examine, how the wealth of the slave trade helped build that city as well. How have you felt about what's been going on?
Yeah, it's really difficult and it's really conflicting. And I think for somebody who's white to try and project or understand, I think that you sound both patronizing and trite if you say, that of course I don't understand what it's like to be black. Of course I don't understand what it's like to have my minority written on my face or to be the only black face in a room and all of these other things. And I think that to compare it to other areas where you are othered, so being the only woman in a room or being the only gay person in a room, it is not the same. And I would never claim that it is. But I hope that I have enough empathy from all of my background to be able to look at the complexity of this and to be able to, even in an age where through social media things are black and white, this is a really complex issue. Really, really complex issue. And I think that you have to be able to accept simultaneously that we have a history in the United Kingdom that needs addressed, and it needs to be addressed in a clear-eyed way. And it's not about changing it or covering it up. It's about absolutely understanding and learning from it, but also accepting that the traditions of our police force and the recent traditions of our police force are not the same as police forces in the United States. And it's not the same history. And I think that this is probably a very clumsy way of trying to express myself, but I think that you have to be able to accept what's the same and also accept what's different too, and have that discussion. And I think in Scotland, there is a revisionism of history that somehow empire was done to Scotland in the same way it was done to other parts of the world, and it wasn't. And we have to be aware and we have to be honest about the fact that Scottish people were part of empire. I think when you're looking at you're looking at the administrators that went to India, that was a place where it was incredibly hard for second and third sons in Scotland to break into the equivalent of the civil service in London. So they went abroad and did it, and were far overrepresented in countries like India. And we have to be honest about that. And I think that there's some really interesting people who are saying things in a quiet way, who perhaps aren't being listened to in the same manner as the loudest voices are in Scotland. And there's a professor at Heriot-Watt University, who's the first black professor in Scotland, who has talked for a long time about some of the monuments in Edinburgh for people who part of their wealth has come from the slave trade, who said, look, I don't want these torn down. What I want is the context that they were in. I want to have the plaque that explains what happened. And we have both America and the UK have such rich histories. I don't think we should conflate them. I think we should be clear-eyed at looking honestly at where we are, where we've come from, and then start having discussions.
I mean, do you think modern Scotland is really honest with itself on race? I mean, Glasgow was my first home as an adult when I was 18. And I remember moving to Scotland and everybody saying, well, Scotland doesn't have a race problem. Partly because we don't have sort of massive communities and we don't have big tension and all the rest of it. And you'll go to places of Scotland and not see a black person, and it means that people don't discriminate. They don't have a problem. And, it never really rung true at the time that was really sort of what was going on. I just wonder what you think now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that most people would like to think that, they have no conceived prejudices, they have no issues. And I think the point that you make about the very, very small number and proportion of people from a black and ethnic minority background in Scotland means that lots of people say that we don't have a problem. But that's lots of white people talking to each other because there aren't any black people in the room, to put it mildly. And we've had, I think, some really successful public information campaigns in the past. I remember when I was living in Glasgow a few years ago, we had a mixed-race footballer called Nigel Quashie that played for the Scotland football team, and it was during a really terrible time when we were awful. I mean, I know lots of people outside of Scotland might say, well, when is that? But it was a particularly bad time during the Bertie Vogts era. And I was in quite a rough pub at the bottom of Thornwood Avenue in Glasgow, which is just opposite the shipyards across the River Clyde. And there was somebody shouting at the television, a man on his own shouting at the television, calling him, you black this, you beep, all of the names under the sun. And this other elderly sort of, working class guy turned around and said, look, mate, he's effing shite because he's effing shite. He's not effing shite because he's black. One country, many cultures. And that one country, many cultures was the tagline of the government information campaign. So you can proactively do things as legislators, as a parliament, to change the minds and views and confront people's perceived prejudices that can filter down into areas. And that this isn't just about relying on people to teach their children better or for schools to do it. There is something that governments can do too to make sure that messages get across.
I mean, it's very interesting talking to you about this, because you are exhibiting what people have always said about you, no matter where their politics are, which is that
I swear a lot.
Well, that you get modernity and you speak kind of like a normal person. And, why do you think, the Conservative Party in particular, at a national level, at a UK level, struggles to get the tone right on these things? If you look at the statements, I mean, I noticed on Twitter you pointed out Rishi Sunak's statement, which was certainly different in tone to
I thought it was really
Boris
thoughtful.
Johnson and Priti Patel.
I don't know. I think we're all products of where we've come from and what's shaped us, and I think some of the things that Priti Patel said about growing up as as a Ugandan Asian in the United Kingdom, means that she has certainly experienced racism in some of its terrible forms, and actually does have a knowledge about this. But as a Home Secretary, it's her job to hold up law and order. So I think in her particular case, I think there's probably a conflict of the personal and the professional there, in terms of ways in which it was put across. But yeah, I do raise somebody like Rishi Sunak up and say I thought his statement was really thoughtful, and I think that it tried to understand something which isn't about coming down on one side. And I think that that's where, in general, not necessarily on this particular issue, but talking in general, I think that where areas of conservatism cross or conflict or come into contrast with each other, that's areas where the party often gets itself into problems. So if I can use an example, as a party, there is a very large streak within us that believes in personal freedom, and that what goes on behind the family door, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody, actually the state should stay out of, and believes in small government. But there's also a part of us that is quite strong in law and order, and the rules exist, and people should exist to believe in the rules, and that anything that helps the law enforcement should be upheld. So we've got into terrible tangles in the past on something like widespread use of CCTV, because that's where these two areas come into conflict and strain. And I think that maybe not just our party, but we've seen it in our party where there are areas of conflict. People are too didactic on one side or the other, and we're not as good at explaining. There is a line here that has lots of gradations in it, and we're going to have to pick where that line is, and there's no perfect answer to that. But here's why we think this is the right place to draw that line.
It's been interesting seeing no politician feeling able to say, I think we should just leave what happened in Bristol, not prosecute anybody, accept that it was a moment of strong feeling. And yes, it was against the law, but there are moments when people break rules and it's right. And nobody from any political party has felt able to say that.
Well, maybe that's because they don't believe it. Maybe
somebody must believe that privately, because privately you hear lots of people saying it.
Right, okay. Well, I'm stuck in my office 450 miles from Westminster, so I don't know what people have been saying there or in Bristol itself. But I think I think when you see somebody trying to set fire to the flags on the cenotaph, which is a war memorial, I think that area of conflict comes in. Like, there are so many people that have so much. I was going to try and say sympathy, but again, that sounds trite and it sounds sanctimonious, and I don't mean it to. But they absolutely understand, feel, and agree with the point of those protests. But there were some of the things that were done in the name of those protests, which you would not agree with. So defacing public statues of prime ministers, for example, or trying to burn the country's flag on a memorial to those who've given a much greater sacrifice than the Ned that's trying to set it on fire with his lighter, with his Zippo.
Yeah. But most people I think get,
that is that area of conflict.
There's always a stupid minority in anything. And most people will have seen what happened and gone, I get that is not right, but it's not really what's going on. Yet the portrayal by the establishment at the moment is that the whole movement has been undermined by a tiny minority of people. That's not right, is it? I mean, it's not what most people think.
Yeah, but I don't think either that in saying that, I don't think anybody's saying that this was a violent protest, or what I mean. I don't think that there's a wholesale slapdown of the people that went on that march either. So I do think the response has been a bit more nuanced, and I think as well. I mean, this isn't new. We've seen it in other areas as well. So when Extinction Rebellion glued themselves to the carriages of public transport, which is what we're supposed to do to get out of our cars, nobody thought that environmentalism was undermined. We just thought that Extinction Rebellion had picked maybe the wrong target that day. So you can condemn the act without condemning, the intention. And I think, maybe the current crop of politicians isn't very good at getting that nuance across, but I don't think that there's an awful lot of people, and I don't particularly think it's a party political issue, actually. I think there's a lot of people in the Labour Party that feel the same way. I thought it was quite a nuanced response from Keir Starmer as well.
Well, let's sort of rewind then and try and work out why you're a little bit different to a lot of politicians in terms of your own history. So what was childhood like for you?
So I grew up in a kind of normal family in Fife. My parents are Glaswegians, so they were both raised on council estates in Glasgow and left school at 15 and 16, and just worked really, really hard, and are from that kind of generation that just believes that hard work is its own reward. And they moved away. My dad moved away to get a job in the mills in the Borders, which is where I was born. And then when all the textile mills shut, we moved up to Fife, again, following him to try and find work. And I went to my local school, my local comprehensive. Myself and my big sister were the first in our family to go to university. And then I became a journalist and then a politician. And now I'm an ex-leader and looking to be an ex-politician quite soon. And we'll see what happens.
But what was your childhood thought about what your future might be? What were you brought up to think you might be when you grew up?
Oh, I knew exactly what I wanted to be when I grew up, and it just changed. So when I was 3, I wanted to be a sheriff with a badge and a gun. And then when I was 6, I wanted to be the first female professional snooker player. And then when I was 9, I think Indiana Jones had come out because I wanted to be an archaeologist. And then I wanted to be a physiotherapist. And then I went to uni to be an English teacher, and came out wanting to be a journalist, which is what I did. I wanted to be a war correspondent, which, apart from a very, very short stint in Kosovo at the tail end of the war when I was a baby journalist, I didn't do, but have since got involved in some charities that go to ex-conflict zones and have been there. And when I was a journalist, I decided that while journalism is a privileged profession, and being able to grab people by the lapels and ask them about what's going on in the world is a privilege, I decided that commentating on what's happening is not what I wanted to do, that I wanted to change things. And being a journalist, that's not the job. The job is to be an honest narrator. And certainly in the BBC at the time that I was there, your job was not to insert yourself into stories. It was not to affect the outcome of stories. It was to be that honest narrator. And, I was young enough and idealistic enough and arrogant enough to think that I could change things. And so I decided to try and get elected as a Tory in Glasgow in the 2010s, which is unusual.
I mean, most of those things that you talk about sort of early on in life are not sort of, they're not traditional girl, gendered aspirations. So yeah. were you ever a girly girl?
I liked horses. That was quite girly, I guess. But I never really played with dolls. I've always liked football. I've always liked cars. I mean, I didn't come out till my mid-20s, and I think everybody knew before me. But you know,
Well, when did you know?
But I've lots of female friends, and that's the thing. I never my friends from school, and well, I have male friends from school. My close friends from school, my close friends from university are all girls, and I love female company as well as being a woman. I'm a woman who loves women, and that means that I appreciate them in kind of all forms of relationships.
So when were you first aware of your sexuality?
In my 20s.
Really? So
Yeah.
so in your teens, what were you thinking? You know, who were you fancying?
I fancied and had relationships with boys through school and university.
And in a sort of totally unconflicted way, or you know, was it a sort of was it a long voyage of discovery, or was it?
Well, I think like a lot of people, particularly of my generation and older, I didn't know until I fell for someone who was female. And I, at the time, for that first relationship, justified it to myself as I'd fallen for the person, not the gender, etc. And it you know, it took several steps to get me to realizing that you know, I was gay. Like I say, it probably wasn't a surprise to lots of other people, but there was a lot of conflict as well. I was brought up in the church. My mum is very religious. You know, I can quote you chapter and verse of scripture about, you know, idolaters and adulterers and sexual offenders, homosexual offenders, and, you know, all of Paul's letters to all of the churches in Corinth and all around the world.
Because that's what you were being taught, or?
No, because I have a terrible predilection to beating myself up more than anybody else ever would.
So were you? I mean, were you taught by either parents, peers, or the church that homosexuality was wrong?
I mean, I think, like I say, I mean, when I was born in Scotland, unlike in England, being in an open, loving, consensual gay relationship was still illegal. It didn't get decriminalised until 2 years after I was born. So we've come a huge way in Scotland. And I think that there was a societal overhang from the generation above me, so my parents' generation, that something which had been illegal was still somehow subversive or dark or wrong or at the fringes. I'm struggling to remember, as you speak to me, any individual lesson or any time anyone sat me down and said, you know, this is wrong or bad or whatever. And I don't think I would, you know, either I've erased it from my mind or I can't remember it. I mean, the church I went to when I was growing up in my home village, and the churches that I went to in Edinburgh as a student and then in Glasgow when I lived there, you know, were not fire and brimstone churches. They were not preaching, you know, about society and societal ills from the pulpit, and that's kind of not the Church of Scotland way anyway. So, you know, I would sort of characterize my church-going experience as a lot more New Testament than Old Testament, if that makes sense to you.
So, if you came from this sort of Christian, make the world a better place tradition, what did you think of politics at the time? You know, when you were a student, you know, were you already a conservative?
I wasn't particularly political at school. I didn't join a political party when I was at university, although I kind of probably knew I was a conservative by then. You know,
why weren't you Labour or a nationalist?
Well, I think I'm not a nationalist because I do believe that we should work together. I don't believe that, and that's one of the reasons I was a Remainer at the European elections as well. I think that human beings get on better when we work with each other. And I think that there's inherent good and inherent value from working across borders, whether they're internal borders or whether they're external borders with people. I believe in the Conservatives and not Labour because I believe in the power of people. I think that enabling people to be able to make decisions about themselves and their lives and their families' lives rather than having kind of the cold hand of government determining which house you have to stay in, which bus routes you get, which jobs you can have, how much money you get to spend. I think that a pound in a pocket is better spent by the person that's earned it. And
so you're already a sort of a small government person, were you? I mean,
yeah.
This sounds sort of a bit
so.
sort of post hoc in a way, sort of trying to work out.
Yeah. To be fair, I mean, I don't think I could have articulated that at 15, 16 in the way I'm articulating it now. But I think that sense of trusting people is something I've always had, of wanting people to be empowered to make their own decisions rather than have somebody else telling them what they have to do. And I think I could probably have articulated that in my teenage years, but I probably couldn't have said that was a small government thing then.
I mean, do you think you could have been a liberal, for example, in another world?
I think I know that it is used as an insult to me by Tories who think that I'm a wet, is that why don't you go off and join the Liberal Democrats? But there's things that they have that I don't agree with particularly. So I don't particularly agree with things like legalising cannabis. I don't particularly agree with, quite a lot of the touch points that they have on proportional representation, that sort of thing. There's quite a lot of touch points for liberalism that I don't don't with. However, there are a lot of people who change their votes between.
I mean, just because you mentioned it, just do a little dogleg on why not? It's quite an unusual thing for you to think, I'd have thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think although I have got more liberal as I have gotten older, and also the debate has moved on a lot.
You must know lots of people who have used it and do use it.
Yeah, and was asked in an election, had I? And yes, I had, and tried it before I tried cigarettes, actually, at the age of 14, on a school trip. And I think there's the idea of opening all of this up, and the fact that it is a gateway. And I don't want to sound like an old-fashioned Tory that says, "Oh, it's a gateway drug, and everyone that tries cannabis is going to immediately go on to like speedballs and smack." Of course they're not. Of course they're not. And I'm, like I say, I grew up in a community where there was a huge amount of drug problems and deprivation. The school I went to, Buckhaven, took in a catchment area where there was a large proportion of people that were on free school meals. This was an heavy industry area built around docklands and factories that had really high levels of unemployment, and drugs destroyed communities, destroyed them. And the idea of making them more prevalent, more easy to get hold of, I just completely anathema to me, because it was such devastation and destruction in the area in which I grew up. And I think as I've gotten older, and the way I've looked at this is, we're doing a lot better at other things that damage your health. So in terms of the social messaging that we have around alcohol consumption, raising the age of tobacco consumption, this just seems to run a complete anathema to what we're trying to do in the public health sphere. So there's a more kind of nuanced, more recent argument I've got, and then there's the kind of just the visceral sort of gut stuff that comes from where I grew up and what I grew out of. But I could be wrong, Krishnan. And now that I don't have to lead people over a mountaintop, I don't have to pretend that I'm right all the time.
And you might change your mind.
And I might change my mind. And I think that it is a sad state of affairs that has become a sign of weakness in politics, and it shouldn't be.
Yeah, I mean, well, let's get to Brexit then. I mean, because obviously you were a famous and high-profile campaigner for Remain. Have things turned out as you thought they would since the referendum?
I had always thought that it was going to be snarled up in process for a long time. And I think that big constitutional change, if it's one thing that Scotland can teach the rest of the UK, is that, nothing's ever done. It's a process. It's not an event. And I think in that case, yes, this is exactly what I expected, that there would be, this would just go on and on and on. There's, it might be an election winning slogan, but getting Brexit done is not something that happens on a set date, and never will be. But I think in terms of where it is in the world's agenda, I thought it would still be higher than it is. I mean, I think coronavirus has knocked everything for six. And I think in terms of the attention that's being paid in this country and the resource that's being put into negotiations, both here and on the continent, I think quite naturally people's eyes are turned elsewhere.
You famously really confronted Boris Johnson over the truth. of the campaign. How damaging, do you think that was? Or do you think we all just moved on, and everybody kind of got it?
To whom?
To
and it clearly wasn't damaging to the other side of the debate, because one of them's prime minister now, so he's doing grand. I mean to
the country. I mean to British politics.
I obviously see things through the lens of the campaign that I was involved in, and to be honest, I was only involved really at the very end of it. But I do think that, from my eyes, I think saying things when you know they aren't true. So some things were said about, for example, the military and things like that, and a standing army in Europe. And the impression was given that it was going to happen tomorrow, and Turkey, everybody knows.
There was all sorts of things.
Yeah, I would suggest, and did suggest, that was not a realistic consequence of what they were arguing as happening in the short term, which is what they were trying to portray it as. And it hasn't happened. So, maybe, I'm right. However, I look at what's happened since, and for the first time in 40 years, the Tories have a 90-seat majority because the guy that was standing up saying these things went back to the country continuing to say them. So I don't, there is obviously a plurality, if not a majority, of people who absolutely agree with that and agree with the way in which those contested truths were put. And, nobody likes to be on a losing side, but we got beat.
Is any of this why you've stepped back? I mean, has any part of you just kind of said, this is not me?
Well, I was pretty honest when I stepped back last August, in that partly it was for family reasons, in terms of my son and kind of old issues with my parents and their health as well. And part of it was political reasons. And, it looked as if we were going for an election, probably in quite short order. After we changed Prime Minister, it was unsustainable having, the tension in the House of Commons of not being able to pass any kind of legislation because we had a minority government, meant that there would at some point have to be some sort of event that happened. And it was really clear to me that we were going to go into that election being the party of Brexit. Which in Scotland, there's a mandate and there's a voice for that. Over 1 million people voted to Brexit in Scotland, which is more than voted, Nicola Sturgeon for First Minister at the last election. So there is a big constituency in Scotland. It's more than the Tories have had in any point that I was leading them. So, they deserve to have a voice, but it couldn't be me. I couldn't do that. And I think it's one of those ones where if the politics has been different, I would have kept on for a bit longer, even with a child. And with those politics, but without a child, I probably could have kept going for a bit longer. But the two of them together, there is a point at which I did as well as I could. I worked as hard as I could for as long as I could. And I wasn't operating at the level at which I'd done before. And that's the time you got to step away. So
when you say if the politics had been different, do you mean if somebody else had won the leadership, if Sajid Javid had won?
I mean, I think I would have, given that I backed him and championed him, I think had it been Saj, I think I probably would have tried to struggle on for at least a few more months. But I'm not entirely sure that I would still be leader today, because the conflict with childcare, etc., is there as well. I think it's more the Brexit issue than personalities. And even if even if one of the other candidates, Michael Gove or somebody else had won, even though Michael's a good friend of mine, I still think I probably wouldn't be leader of the Scottish Conservatives right now.
See, people will sort of listen to everything you're saying and just say, she it must be that she can't stand Boris Johnson. Is there a bit of that?
Well, look, I mean,
and everything he stands for, that sort of public school establishment thing,
Well, in terms of personality, we get on fine, and we can be in a room together and share a conversation and all the rest of it. But we have, we're from fundamentally different wings of the Tory party. And the idea that I can't get on with somebody that is from his background is nonsense. David Cameron and I had a very close relationship, and they come from very similar backgrounds. It was more the Brexit issue than personalities, I think. And also, there's a disconnect between where I am and where a lot of the Conservative Party in Scotland was. And it was the first issue where we'd had that. from the time that I became leader, I'd worked really hard to, as somebody that was a complete unknown to our party and our voters, to bring them with me as I tried to add other people to who voted for us and to try to extend our appeal. But I tried to always manage to keep the backbone of our party with us, because a party's nothing without its members and its activists and the people that do the hard work. Leaders come and go, but members can be there for many multiples of time longer than that. And there was a disconnect between me and the membership too. A lot of our members were very passionate Brexiteers, and this split the party in a way that something like unionism didn't. That had bound us together. So to say that it's a personality issue doesn't get the complexity of it.
And how comfortable are you with the power of Dominic Cummings, the man who was behind the Brexit?
Well, one of the things that's kind of odd is there's nothing as an ex-politician or an ex-leader. So all of the things that you sort of take for granted, and you shouldn't, because they are a privilege and you should always remember they're a privilege. But the stuff you take for granted, being able to walk into Number 10, being able to pick up the phone and, have a phone call with the Prime Minister, all of these sorts of things, they immediately disappear overnight. So when all of the Dominic Cummings things broke, I was trying to remember if I'd ever met the man. And he's been around, the high echelons of the Conservative Party as an advisor for years and years and years. And I'm guessing when I went to political cabinet, he was one of the advisors that was sitting around the corner of the room, and he'd worked for Michael Gove for a while when he was at education, but I literally don't think I'd ever met him. And because I resigned so soon after the Prime Minister became the Prime Minister, I'd not seen the Number 10 working since he did. Obviously, I'd met Boris when he came up to Scotland, but he didn't have Dominic Cummings with him that I could see. And I literally have never met him. So I don't know how much of it is fable. And there's a lot of myth-making in politics. There's a huge amount of myth-making in politics, and how much of it is real.
But he clearly has the kind of power that no advisor has ever had over executive decisions and power, and and an authority over a lot of ministers as well. And I just, do you think that's a good thing in British politics? Regardless of Cummings himself, but the idea of somebody who is unelected, appointed by the Prime Minister, wielding that kind of power.
So you will always get elected people saying, no, it should always be the politicians in charge. And they are, and they're the ones with whom the buck stops and who makes the decisions. And the advisors advise, the politicians decide. But you will always hear people that have been on the other side of that as spads saying, bloody politicians, blah, 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 this is what they need to do. They need to stop, pandying to this, that, and the other. So, I think it depends whether you've come up on the elected or the unelected side, what your view is on that, if you're involved in politics at any level. But I think I will pick you up on that, this idea that there's never been advisors who have a lot of power before.
I think that's. I said.
I
there have been powerful spads, but not anywhere near his power.
And you don't think that Peter Mandelson did that as well? Like I just don't believe you.
He was a politician. I just don't. Mandelson was a politician, fine, he was then in the Lords, so he was unelected.
Exactly, and he was brought back, and that's the thing.
But he was front line in that respect,
He had been, but then he wasn't, and then he was an advisor with a huge amount of power. So, I'm sorry, the idea that we've never seen this, I think, is nonsense. That's not to say that as somebody who... Well, I was about to say, as somebody who puts their name in a ballot paper, of course I come down on the side of, it's the people that can be voted out of office. It's the people that, the public can see, smell, the ones that stand at the dispatch box. Of course they're the ones that have to be in charge. And they are, because whatever you say about Dominic Cummings, he is not the Prime Minister of this country. He can advise the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister can choose to take his advice. He can choose to reject his advice. But, he has no executive power in that sense. The Prime Minister does.
And do you think his eye test in Barnard Castle has done so much damage that he should resign? Or at least consider his position as your party leader says?
Well, look, I think that nobody wants to lose somebody that is integral to trying to tackle the biggest health emergency that we've seen in over 100 years. And if he is integral to helping the government do that, you can absolutely understand why the Prime Minister wants to hold on to him.
He's just too important.
Here's where I get to indulge, now that I'm not the leader anymore, I get to indulge in the one hand and the other, and please indulge me, Krish. But I do think that if a key part of tackling that pandemic is about getting the messaging right, and it is about having the country come with you and trust you. I think that it did damage that. And, the Prime Minister decides who he hires and who he fires. That is a Prime Minister's prerogative. There's lots of things that Prime Ministers aren't in charge of, but who's in his cabinet is up to him. Who's his advisor is up to him. But I think when we look back at this, I think you'll see that damage was done.
And do you think that will be electoral damage in Scotland?
Well, I think Scotland's a complex place. There's lots of things that go on. We'll see. I think that 3 months ago...
It's not looking good at the moment, is it?
Well, look, 3 months ago, all of the commentariat were saying that Nicola's jacket was on a sugary peg and that the Alex Salmond trial might do for her. And 4 months ago, they were saying that Derek Mackay was a shoe-in to be the next First Minister of Scotland and Nicola Sturgeon's successor. Now, Derek Mackay hasn't been seen for 4 months since he was outed by a newspaper grooming a 16-year-old boy on the day of the budget. And Nicola Sturgeon is probably got better ratings than she's ever had in the entire time that she's been First Minister. So the one thing that you can say with that? Well, one thing you can say about politics in Scotland is it's fast moving, and if anybody tells you they know what's going to happen 10 months from now, they're lying.
Can you explain why? I mean, it's very, very unusual, isn't it, for a party of government, a leader who's been in power for so long, to still be as popular as Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP are? Is it because the alternatives are so unpalatable to the Scottish people, or is it something else?
Well, I think... the constitutional question has been the divide in Scotland for going on for nearly 10 years now. So before the referendum and markedly more virulent after it. And I think if you're the party that stands on one side, and if there are three parties that stand on the other side, you're going to be electorally strong if you have the biggest microphone because you're the government and you make that issue the defining factor of every election. Yes, I mean, that. I think the caravan for nationalism is bigger than the SNP's, the choice of the SNP politically. However, the SNP is the receptacle for that whole caravan.
Your great fear and challenge, again, to Boris Johnson was how many jobs would be lost after Brexit. Is that still your big fear?
I think that the coronavirus is going to cost jobs. And I think that...
and it will be compounded.
Well, it depends on the deal, and that's why I want a deal, and that's why I would absolutely urge everybody that's making decisions to have an extension to get a good deal rather than just to walk away. Because I think that you look at how many millions of people are currently on furlough, how many millions of people their only income is coming from the Treasury. Do those jobs exist when the Treasury starts tapering that money down? How many businesses go to the wall? The UK government, absolutely, the things that happen when you have big inquiries into big events like this pandemic, they always focus on what you can do better. But I mean, at some point, you have to put your hands up and say, look, some things have been done really well. I mean, whoever the people that were squirreling away in HMRC, in the Treasury, to build the architecture, to deliver these systems, to construct them, architect them, deliver them, and get money into people's pockets is phenomenal. But at some point, that starts tapering down. And whether these jobs exist at the end of that or not, whether the companies that these jobs exist for, we don't know. And I hope it's a V-shaped recovery. But, anybody that tells you they know what's coming, again, they don't. We've never seen this. And you look at the Spanish flu 112 years ago, and it's not the same. So
coming back to changing the world, I mean, after your first act of politics is over, how are you gonna make the world a better place? Or do you feel you sort of earned a period in which you can concentrate on you and your family and making some money and not worrying about the rest of the world for a while?
Well, I think that. I've been really clear about the promises that I've made. And, I made promises when I became leader of the party against all of the odds, coming from nowhere, not from a political background, that, I would give everything to the party for as long as I led it. And that meant that my family has come second. It meant that, lots of loved ones, friends, etc., they have come behind decisions that I had to make. And oftentimes the really important has come second to the immediate, which is some decision that needs made or whatever. And I have made a commitment to myself and to my family that at least for the next few years, until my son, and hopefully we want to extend our family, and hopefully any little brothers and sisters get to school age, they will be my primary focus, and they will have a lot of my time. So I'm not planning of going from a really big job into another really big job for the next couple of years. So yes, I am, I'm taking a couple of years off the front line, if you like, and I am going to concentrate on my family. And I think everybody that has a family changes the world in some small way, because their children come into it and they change the world too.
And if you could wave a magic wand and change the world, how would you do it?
I think I'd make every girl in the world educated to the same level as every boy. I think that something like that changes poverty, it changes violence, it changes decision making, it changes so many things. I think if you could drop one pebble in the pool and see how far ripples go, I think educating every girl in the world to the level of every man, and having have the same status as man when they finish their schooling in whichever country you're talking about, I think that creates the most ripples and the most good.
Ruth Davidson, thank you very much indeed for sharing your ways to change the world. I hope you all enjoyed that. And if you did, then please do give us a rating and a review. You can watch all of these interviews on the Channel 4 News YouTube channel. Our producer is Rachel Evans. Until next time, bye-bye.